The year is 1849. The state is Maryland. The temperature is close to freezing, and a woman, a black woman, is standing at the edge of a dark forest. Behind her is a plantation, chains, a life that was never hers to begin with. Ahead of her, nothing, absolute darkness, no map, no compass, no guide, no one waiting for her on the other side. She had been told what they do to the ones who run. She had seen it with her own eyes. The whip marks, the broken fingers, the ones who came back dragging their legs, because the slave catchers had done something to their knees so they could never run again. She had heard the screaming that filled those nights. She knew exactly what was waiting for her if she failed, and she ran anyway. Not 10 miles, not 50, not 100, 900 miles on foot, in the dark alone, through forests so black she could not see her own hands in front of her face, through rivers so cold they locked her joints mid-stride, through slave states where any white man had the legal right and the government-backed, federally protected legal right to drag her back in chains. 900 miles, in winter, with a traumatic brain injury, and blackouts that could drop her unconscious without a single second of warning. And when she finally crossed into the free north, do you know what she did? She turned around and went back. Not once, not twice. 13 times. 13 times she walked back into the most dangerous territory in America to bring out her people, her family, complete strangers she had never met in her life. This is the story of Harriet Tubman, but not the 2 paragraphs they gave you in school. This is the dark truth. To understand Harriet Tubman, the real Harriet Tubman, you first have to understand the world that tried to break her. Not the sanitized version, not the comfortable version, the actual world she was born into. She was born Araminta Ross, sometime around 1822. On a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. No official birth certificate, because enslaved people were not recorded as births. They were recorded as property. She had no legal name of her own, no legal rights, no claim to her own body, her own children, her own future. She was listed in an estate inventory the way a chair would be listed. An object, a possession with a dollar value. The United States government agreed with this. The United States Constitution protected this. Her mother was a woman named Rit Ross, and I need you to hold that woman in your mind for a moment. Because without Rit Ross, there is no Harriet Tubman. When Araminta was still a small child, a slaveholder came to the plantation and tried to take one of her siblings, to sell that child away from the family, away from everything that child had ever known. Rit Ross stood in the doorway. She looked that man in the eye, and she told him, "You will take this child over my dead body." He backed down. An enslaved black woman with no legal rights whatsoever backed him down with nothing but the force of her will. That courage did not skip a generation. By age 5, Araminta was working, not playing, not learning her letters, working, carrying wood, scrubbing floors, minding other people's children. By age 7, she was hired out to neighboring farms, rented out like a tool that other people could borrow. One of the first women she was sent to. A woman history records only as Miss Susan, used her as a night nurse. Araminta had to check the baby's cradle through the night. Every time that baby stirred and cried, she had to rock it back to sleep. And every time the baby cried and Araminta was too slow, Miss Susan whipped her, whether Araminta was asleep or awake, whether she was exhausted or rested. The whip came. She wore those scars for the rest of her life. But the wound that changed everything, the wound that shaped everything that came after, happened when she was still a teenager. An overseer was trying to catch an enslaved man who had briefly left the fields. Without permission, he ordered Araminta to help him block the doorway, to help him catch a man whose only crime was stepping outside. She refused. The overseer grabbed a 2-pound lead weight from the counter. He threw it at the fleeing man. It missed, and it hit Araminta directly in the skull. She did not die, but she came close. She lay unconscious for days. Her family was not sure she would wake up. When she finally opened her eyes, something had changed. For the rest of her life, she would suffer sudden, violent blackouts. Without warning, without control. She could be mid-stride and simply fall, like a light being switched off. Doctors today would call it narcolepsy, caused by traumatic brain injury. Harriet Tubman called it something else. She said that during those blackouts, she heard the voice of God, not a metaphor, not a poetic way of saying she felt inspired. She said she received specific instructions. Turn left at the cedar tree. Wait in this barn until morning. Cross the river here, not there. The people who traveled with her would later say that every time Harriet followed those visions, every single time they avoided the patrols, the thing they used to hurt her became the thing that protected her. In 1849, word came that shook Harriet to her core. Her enslaver, a man named Edward Brodes, had died, and when an enslaver died, his estate had to be settled, and that meant his human property, his human beings, would be divided up and sold to pay his debts, sold to wherever the highest bid came from. The cotton fields of Mississippi, the sugar plantations of Louisiana, places so violent, so relentlessly brutal, that even enslaved people in Maryland spoke of them the way people speak of a death sentence. Harriet knew she was on that list. She could feel it. And she made a decision that night. She told 2 of her brothers. They said yes. They would go with her. In September of 1849, 3 figures slipped off the Brodes plantation and vanished into the night. Within 2 days, her brothers broke. The fear became too real. The forest was too dark. The distance was too vast. The consequences of being caught filled their minds until they could think of nothing else. They turned back, and they begged Harriet, begged her to come with them. She refused. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Her brothers were heading back to the only life they had ever known, back to the pain, but also back to the familiar, back to the only safety that word had ever meant for an enslaved person. And Harriet chose the darkness over the familiar. She chose the unknown over the certain. She turned away from her brothers and kept walking. She traveled only at night. During the day she hid, under piles of hay, in root cellars, in the crawl spaces of houses belonging to free, black families who risked everything, their homes, their freedom, their children, to shelter her for a few hours. She navigated by the North Star when the sky was clear. When clouds covered the stars, she navigated by the moss on the north side of tree trunks. When there were no trees, she navigated by feel, by instinct, by the voice in her head that she said had never once lied to her. She was cold in a way that most people will never experience cold. The kind that goes past discomfort and becomes pain. The kind that makes your fingers stop working. That makes you question whether staying still and dying might be more merciful than taking one more step. She kept moving. She was terrified. She said this herself. She admitted it openly in interviews decades later. She said the fear never fully left her. Not on the first journey, not on the 13th, but she kept moving because fear of capture was greater than fear of the dark. And the love for her family was greater than both. 90 miles from the Brodes plantation, Harriet Tubman crossed the line into Pennsylvania, into free territory, into a place where, on paper at least, no one could legally call her property. She described that moment for the rest of her life. She said she looked down at her hands, just looked at them, turning them over, trying to understand if she was the same person. If the same body that had been enslaved one day could genuinely be free the next. She said there was a golden light over everything, like the world had changed color. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. And then came the other feeling, the one that hit her like a second blow. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land because my father, my mother, my brothers were all down there. She was free, and freedom felt like the loneliest thing she had ever experienced. She stayed in Philadelphia only long enough to work, earn a small amount of money, and make a decision that every rational person in her life would have told her was suicide. She was going back. They called her Moses, not her friends. Not just the enslaved community, everyone, both sides of the line. The enslaved people called her Moses because she was doing exactly what the biblical Moses did, leading her people out of bondage, through the wilderness toward the promised land. The slaveholders called her something else. They called her the most dangerous woman in America, and they put a bounty on her head that by some accounts reached $40,000. In today's money, well over $1 million. For one black woman on foot in the dark. That number tells you everything you need to know about how afraid they were of her. Between 1849 and 1860, Harriet Tubman made 13 missions into slave territory. 13 times she walked back into the most heavily monitored, most brutally policed region in North America. She personally led approximately 70 people to freedom. Her instructions, her maps, her network helped hundreds more find their way out. She never lost a single person, not one, across 13 missions. Over a decade, through every kind of weather, every kind of danger, every level of patrol, not one person. Now I need to stop here, because the way the Underground Railroad is usually taught makes it sound almost gentle, quaint even. Secret tunnels, friendly strangers, a kind of American fairy tale where good people helped other good people and everyone found their way north. That is not what this was. What Harriet Tubman ran was a military operation, with military precision, military discipline, and military consequences for any deviation from the plan. She sent signals through the network weeks before a rescue, coded messages, embedded in songs that enslaved people sang in the fields, spirituals that sounded like worship but were actually coordinates. She chose her timing deliberately, Saturday nights, because slave masters could not place a newspaper advertisement about a runaway on a Sunday. Newspapers did not run on Sunday, which bought a full extra day before the manhunt could officially begin. She disguised her groups, old clothing, props, forged papers. She once dressed a group of men in women's clothing to confuse anyone watching for a party of mixed escapees. And she carried a pistol, which she was fully prepared to use, not just against slave catchers and their dogs, against anyone in her own group who showed signs of turning back, because she understood something, brutal and true. One panicking person could get every single person in that group killed, captured, sold to the Deep South, which was a fate many considered worse than death. So when someone's fear became so overwhelming that they whispered, "Maybe we should go back," Harriet would press that pistol to their head and say, quietly, without emotion, "You will be free or you will die." She meant it, and every single person in every single group she ever led knew she meant it, and that is exactly why every single one of them made it. On one mission, the group included a newborn infant, a baby young enough to cry at any moment and betray the entire group to the patrols. Harriet sedated the child with paregoric, a common medicine of the era, and she carried that sleeping baby through miles of cold darkness in her own arms, never setting it down, never stopping. On another mission, she led her own elderly father, a man named Ben Ross, who could have been stopped and questioned at any point by any patrol. Harriet blindfolded him for the final miles, so that if he was ever caught and asked, "Did you see any runaway slaves come through here?" he could look his questioner in the eye and answer, honestly, "No, I have not seen a soul." A legal technicality, but in that world, a technicality that saved a life. This was the mind of Harriet Tubman, always thinking, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of everyone hunting her. In 1850, the United States government made a move that sent shockwaves through every free black community in the North. President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. Let me tell you exactly what this law said, because I think it is important that you understand the government that Harriet Tubman was fighting against. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime, punishable by fine and imprisonment for any person anywhere in the United States to assist a runaway enslaved person. It required federal marshals in free states to actively help recapture escaped black people and return them to slavery. It gave slave catchers the power to seize any black person they claimed was a runaway, with no trial, no jury, no hearing, no burden of proof. And it meant that free black people who had been living in the North for years or decades could be seized and dragged south into bondage based on nothing more than one man's word. There was no longer safe ground anywhere in the United States of America for a black person. Harriet Tubman heard about this law. She processed it, and she changed the route. Instead of leading people to Philadelphia, 90 miles, she now led them to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, beyond the reach of American law, beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act, beyond the reach of everything that had been built to hold her people in chains. 900 miles instead of 90, and she kept going. The bounty on her head grew, $40,000. Some accounts say higher. Slave catchers, hired trackers, trained dogs specifically bred to follow human scent for miles. All of it hunting one woman. They never came close. Not once, in 13 missions, over a decade. She was not caught. She was not betrayed. She was not stopped. And here is the part that should stay with you. She was not superhuman. She had a traumatic brain injury. She had blackouts. She had no formal education, no legal rights, no weapons beyond that pistol and her own mind. But she had something her hunters could never manufacture and could never buy. She knew exactly what she was fighting for, and they were only fighting for money. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet Tubman did not step back. She stepped forward. She was personally recruited, by Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts to serve the Union Army as a spy, a scout, and a military intelligence officer. Let that land. A black woman, in 1862, serving as a military intelligence officer, in a war being fought, in large part and over whether people who looked like her had the right to exist as human beings. She led a network of black spies operating deep behind Confederate lines. She could move through the South like smoke. Because who looks twice at a black woman working in the Confederate South? She looked like she belonged. She knew the terrain. She knew how to read people. She knew how to move at night and leave no trace. She had been training for this work her entire life without knowing that was what it was. June 1863, the Combahee River, South Carolina. Harriet Tubman guided 3 Union Army gunboats through Confederate-controlled waters. At night, through territory she had never personally traveled, but had mapped entirely through her intelligence network. She knew where the Confederate torpedoes, the underwater mines, had been planted in the river. Every single placement. She guided those 3 boats through without a single detonation. As the boats moved through the river, striking Confederate supply lines along the shore, over 700 enslaved men, women, and children ran to the banks and were taken aboard. 700 people. In a single night, Harriet Tubman became the first woman in American history to plan and lead an armed military raid. Not the first black woman, the first woman in American history, period. The United States government's response? They refused to pay her pension for 30 years after the war ended. 30 years, the same government she had risked her life to serve. She finally received compensation in 1899, not for her own service, but as the widow of her second husband, who had been a Union soldier. They could not even give her the pension in her own name. She died on March 10, 1913. She was approximately 91 years old, surrounded by family, by the people she had spent her life fighting for. Her last words, spoken aloud to the room, were, "I go to prepare a place for you." She had been preparing places for people her entire life. They tried to erase her, not in the soft, bureaucratic way, not just leaving her out of textbooks or reducing her to a footnote. They tried to erase her while she was still breathing. $40,000 on her head. Federal law specifically written to recapture her. An entire system of government designed to make sure people like her never got free. And still, she walked 900 miles through darkness, 13 times back into the fire, 3 gunboats through mined waters, 30 years of fighting a government that had used her and discarded her. They gave her 2 paragraphs in a history textbook. She deserved a monument the size of a mountain. But here is what I need you to take from this story. Harriet Tubman was not superhuman. She was a woman with a brain injury. No education, no money, no legal existence in the eyes of the country she was born in. The only things she possessed were her faith, her courage, and her absolute, immovable refusal to accept the world as it was handed to her. So the next time the world tells you that you are too small, too poor, too broken, too far from where you are trying to go, I want you to remember a woman standing at the edge of a dark forest, with everything stacked against her, with every reason to stay, with every reason to be afraid, who chose the darkness over the chains, who walked 900 miles, who went back again and again for the people she loved, and never looked back. This has been Dark Truth. If this story moved you, drop her name in the comments.